Next on our program is Eva Moffitt. She has a strong background in agriculture and is a highly qualified geospatial technology, having been awarded a University Science Medal for her studies in geoscience. She previously worked 4 years in the mining industry before moving into the ag sector. Hailing from Temora, she's grown up on a family broadacre farm and has practiced a number of precision ag activities on this property before joining the Precision Ag Company. With a plethora of soil sampling in the region, today Eva will talk about the cost analysis of soil testing and bring practical insights to the benefits of soil testing.
So as Nicole mentioned, I'm a PA advisor with Precision Agriculture, and I've been there for about 18 months now. So today I'm going to give you a bit of a cost analysis of grid soil mapping for an example paddock, and then I'm going to run through some of the results from this area and give you a bit of a summary, mostly focusing on pH and variable rate lime, but I'll have a few extra things at the end. So before I get stuck into that, just a very quick run over of what grid soil sampling is. I think from the other presentations today it's probably been covered fairly well, but so on the left, our traditional Transact style soil sample where you're getting one result for a paddock. On the right we've got a 2 hectare grid. So as Adrian alluded to, obviously the higher the resolution the better. So at the moment 2 hectares is about the highest resolution that we can do that's cost effective basically. So as soon as you get tighter resolution your costs go up. But we still think as far as accuracy goes, an actual soil sample is the best way to be collecting data on pH. So there you go, you've got a soil sample for each of those 2 hectare areas. So the way that we go about our data collection is just using side-by-side bikes with soil auger on the side. We design our sampling plans in the office, so we avoid any areas that headlands and other things that we might not want to sample. It's a 0 to 10 centimetre. Obviously that could be varied if the client requested it, and we have done deeper or shallower, but our standard product is a 0 to 10. We take 8 subsamples per sample, so the field technician will have that sampling plan loaded up on their GPS in the bike. They'll go to the start of the mini transect, collect their 8 soil samples. Those are going to a bag which is barcoded, that's scanned and sent to the laboratory for wet chemistry analysis. So we use APAL Ag Laboratory in Adelaide, and we have quite a good relationship with APAL, and they're set up to take sort of bulk soil samples and fit what we do basically. So we take the soil samples, 2 to 3 weeks later we get our results and we map those up. So in this example paddock you can see there's quite a bit of variation in the pH that we've got. So on the southern side of the paddock we've got values that are already sort of neutral or alkaline, some areas that are probably we want to avoid liming, and then in the northern end of the paddock we've got more acidic values, in this particular example ranging as low as 4.3 pH. Average for this paddock interestingly was 5.2, so if we had have taken our regular Transact style soil sample we might have thought that the paddock was in reasonably good condition, and we might have, maybe applied some lime, but probably not very high rates. So before I go any further, just a note about pH stratification. So a grid soil map is only going to give you a 2D map of the paddock, of the spatial variability of the paddock. So additional investigation is required if we want to determine our 3D spatial variability, i.e. down the soil profile. And obviously this is going to depend on your farming system and your management history. So if you're in a system where you've been minimum till, no till for a number of years, you're almost certainly going to have pH stratification. So you're going to have higher levels at the top and then possibly an acid throttle band, and then getting back into more alkaline conditions. So how do we work out if we have stratification occurring? Currently, there's not really a way that we can do that on the grid that's cost effective. Ideally, we would take some segmented soil tests, so 5 centimetre increment tests. Those are quite time consuming and fiddly, so they're expensive unless you do them yourself, essentially. Another way that you can look at pH stratification is just by using an Infield Ph Test Kit like the one on the left, or you might do a bit of a combination of both. So you might take a few tests to calibrate your results and then go and have a look, dig some holes, dig some soil pits. And then that's going to help you determine your target pH rate, how high you want to aim for, and also your management decisions, so whether you need to incorporate basically. Righto, so we get our grid soil map and then we make a VR lime application map from that. So in this example, we've got this area down here that was already neutral to alkaline, so we've been able to not apply lime down here, whereas up here where we've got more acid areas, we've put rates of sort of 3.5 or up to 3.5 and 2.5, 3 tonne. So we've used 143 tonnes of lime over 125 hectares, so our average is 1.1 tonnes per hectare. Secondly, we've got a pH target of 5.5 in calcium chloride. We've still got some areas that have a nil application, but then we've also amped up the rates on the rest of the paddock to bring that pH up to 5.5. So we've used 250 tonnes of lime over that 125 hectares, so 2 tonne per hectare average, but still being able to apply 4 tonne in those areas that needed quite a bit more. So have a look at a few of the dollars around that. So our VR application at 5.2, our lime at $60 a tonne, we've spent about $8.5 grand on it. Mapping, $15 a hectare, spent about $1,800. So we've ended up $10,500 to lime that paddock to 5.2 pH. VR at 5.5, we spent $15,000 on lime, $1,800 on mapping. So we're looking at almost $17,000 to get that paddock to 5.5 pH. Lastly, I've included a blanket at 1.5 tonnes. So I picked that rate because if we had have done that transect soil sample, we might have thought a tonne and a half of lime might be adequate. It's also a rate that, you know, different people have different typical blanket rates, so that's somewhere in the middle from what I hear. So at $60 a tonne, we've spent $11,250 on lime to blanket that. So considering we've done that blanket application, let's have a look at what we would get theoretically if we made that application. So if we put 1.5 tonnes over that whole paddock, what we've done is essentially limed areas that didn't need it and underlimed in other areas. So the overlimed areas, we have potential for some Group B herbicide carryover and also nutrient lockup in alkaline soils, and also just poor resource allocation, so it's just money wasted because we didn't need to put it there. And then our underlined areas, so potential for yield penalties, particularly later in the rotation. So we've just limed that paddock and we think it's in pretty good condition, but actually we've got areas that have only just made it sort of almost to 5 calcium chloride. So as we go through the rotation and it reacidifies, then that's when we might see some yield penalties in that area. So can we put $1 per hectare on that? I'm going to have a bit of a go, but it involves making a few assumptions. So firstly, we need to consider the relationship between soil pH and relative yield. So general rule of thumb is a value of 4.8 pH. If we can get the paddock to 4.8, we're not seeing any yield penalties related to soil acidity. Once we go below that, that's when we start seeing penalties. So if we consider a pH of 4.5, for example, the yellowy mustard line is wheat. So at 4.5 pH, we're getting about a 4% yield penalty. So if we consider a wheat crop of 3 tonnes per hectare and $240 a tonne, then that equates to about $22 per hectare of penalty due to that soil acidity. Canola being slightly more sensitive, we're getting maybe 6% penalty, which is equating through to $36 per hectare. Barley being more sensitive again, we're getting maybe 9% yield penalty, which is going through to $63 per hectare, so it's starting to add up. And then also, which is a bit harder to quantify in dollar terms, is increased weed pressure. So if you've got areas where the crop's stressed and you've got weeds coming in, setting seed, then that's going to be causing you problems down the track that aren't apparent, particularly in that yield penalty. So if we just have a look at a very theoretical rotation and we make a couple of assumptions, we'll try and put a dollars value on this. So the first assumption is that our lime has been incorporated throughout the topsoil and it's had sufficient time to neutralise. The second assumption, for the purpose of this example, is that the soil is reacidified by half a pH unit over that 5-year rotation. So obviously that's going to vary with the buffering capacity of your soil, which is dependent on your situation, your fertiliser inputs and your crop selection, etc. So along the top here we've got our 5.5 target pH VR application. We're not getting any yield penalties at all because that whole paddock is staying above 4.8 throughout that whole period. Our VR 5.2, we're seeing no yield penalties really for the first few years, and then towards the end of the rotation we've got a few areas that are dropping under that 4.8, so slight yield penalty. And then our blanket 1.5 tonnes per hectare, we're seeing not too bad in the first couple of years, but then with reacidification we're seeing a few, like the canola and the barley, and then toward the end the wheat as well, we're seeing a yield penalty of nearly $32 a hectare just due to the acid areas in that paddock. So that equates through in dollar terms about $500 all up in our 5.2 application and nearly $4,000 in our blanket 1.5 tonne application. So if we go back to our costs and we add these on, we're now getting our 5.2 at around $11,000, our 5.5 nearly $17,000 still, and our blanket adding on that $4,000 is around $15,000. So we're starting to see not too much of a difference between these two, but we still would say that our VR 5.2 has been the most cost efficient. But the other thing to consider is what have we actually ended up with from that management practice. So this is a theoretical pH after each of those applications. So our variable rate pH maps are reasonably similar, except the 5.5 has obviously all those areas are getting to around 5.5, 5.6, whereas our VR 5.2 target is only getting to around 5.2, 5.3. Our blanket over here at 1.5 tonne, despite it costing almost as much as the 5.5, this is what we're ending up with. So this one here is in a better state when we come back to relime it. So the difference between these two I've just got a question mark there. So why would we target a 5.5 instead of a 5.2 when it's cheaper? So I've put a few comments in here. So it's giving us a greater buffer or a safety net, which gives us the option to extend our rotation or increase the period between reliming. Say we got down the track and we thought, it's time to relime, but it's been a tighter year and we don't think we can afford it this year. Well, we've got that buffer or safety net. Liming to a higher target pH means less passes, so especially if you're engaging a contractor, it's better to do more in one pass than lots of individual passes. Robust topsoil rates are required if you're attempting to ameliorate subsoil acidity. So if you've got acid soils down below, you're going to have to up your rates and work that in if you're going to do anything about it. Disadvantages, so it's a lumpier upfront investment is the main one, and then also just your practicality of spreading if you're starting at a very low pH. So that difference between these two, that $5,000 odd, $6,000, that's stored in the soil really. There's a way to look at it. So now I'm just going to take you through a bit of the data from the mapping that we've done in this area in the last sort of 18 months. So I've taken about a 100-kilometre radius of West Wyalong and I've filtered our data set for that. I've also added in a couple from up further north because I felt like they'd be relevant to today. So 320 paddocks are in this data set. Nearly 15,000 samples taken, which is about 30,000 hectares. So interestingly, the average of that data set was 5.14 pH in calcium chloride. So I did the same analysis last year based on all the data in my area, which is basically here down to the border. And that average was 4.92, I think. So this data set is slightly more alkaline. I think some of that might be some of that heavier bland country coming through, but also maybe just the individual farmers that are in that region or something like that, I'm not sure. So I've got a very busy graph coming up, but I'm going to explain it and hopefully you can catch my drift. Right, so each of those grey columns, bars, represents one paddock out of the 320 paddocks. So along the x-axis, we've got 1 through to 320. On the y-axis, we've got pH in calcium chloride. So what I've done is I've sorted all those paddocks by mean pH. So I've lined them up all in a row by their average pH. So over on the left, we've got our most acid paddocks. Over on the right, our most alkaline paddocks. I've also done a bit of a top cut on the top of the data because what we often see is where someone's dumped lime in the paddock or for whatever reason we'll see an anomalously high value in the corner of a paddock, which meant that this graph had a whole heap of high results coming through. So done a little bit of a top cut to get rid of that effect, and then what we're left with is the range of each paddock from its lowest to its highest pH reading. So I've just put some lines in there to make it a bit easier to interpret. The bottom one is yield constraining, so that's at 4.8. So anything below that bottom line is potentially yield constraining. So that's yield that isn't on the table because we can't access it because of soil pH issues. Anything above the middle line is adequate, so that's 5.2, and then above 5.5 is ideal, but it doesn't really require liming, so there's no point spending money on any of these areas here. So things to note, only about maybe 1/8 of the average pHs were above 5.5, but a whole bunch of the data, in fact almost 25% of the data was above 5.5. So there's a whole lot of areas within paddocks that don't need liming that aren't picked up by that average soil test, I guess you'd say. Down this end, these paddocks here, I'd say, when is it not economic to implement a variable rate approach? If you know your paddock is really acidic and you've done some soil tests and there's not much variation in soil texture, so it's going to be probably a fairly light sandy soil, just go and put 3 or 4 tonnes of lime on, because your map isn't probably going to help you very much. Other than that, most of these paddocks in the bulk in this middle area have considerable amount of variation that implementing a VR strategy is going to be an economic win for you. So as a sort of average across the whole data set, we're seeing at least about a half unit of pH difference in every paddock. And then just to graph this data in a little bit different manner. Here we've got histogram, so it's got our bins, so 23% of the data was above 5.5 pH, and then we had 31% below 4.8, so at 21 plus our 10. So these are areas here that traditionally might have been underlimed if we were doing a blanket approach, and then almost a quarter of the data here that didn't need to be limed. So just a quick note, grid soil mapping, other opportunities. So I haven't gone into any sort of economic analysis for other parameters apart from pH. However, I just thought I'd mention if you are getting your paddock grid tested, those soils are already going to the lab. So if we did want to test other things at the same time, it becomes quite cost effective to do so. So 2 of the things that we do are cation exchange capacity. So basically, rather than running an EM over the paddock to map your soil types, we can do a pretty crude soil type map just using our CEC. That'll also give us our exchangeable sodium percentages, which might help us go straight to a variable rate gypsum map. The only thing to be careful of there is that it's only a topsoil map, so when you're looking at sodicity, you really want to be looking deeper into the profile as well. But as far as giving you some information, putting some numbers around what you're dealing with for $4 a hectare, if you're already doing the pH mapping, it's something that quite a few people have taken up. The other one is phosphorus, so I'd say probably half of those, so half of the data that I presented for the pH, they also got phosphorus analysed, and we are seeing quite variable phosphorus levels throughout our paddocks as well. So that may be something that you can manage. You may not have variable rate on your cedar per se, but quite a few people are doing top dressing, whether that's variable rate or whether it's just manually going out and targeting some deficient areas. Also chicken litter, as Brodie discussed, and yeah, some other options there. So I've just got the phosphorus data in a similar format to the pH data. So interesting to note, our overall average there is 48 milligrams per kilogram. So if we consider normal sort of critical value for coal P being 35 milligrams per kilogram, which is the red line, there's a significant portion of the data set is above 35. So that opens up the opportunity for us to potentially mine down some of those phosphorus reserves that are in our soil. But having a P budget, i.e. a map, is a good place to start, because we don't want to be missing out in areas that still do need that phosphorus. So And then there's that data in a similar fashion. So we've got 35% of the data was below 35 milligrams per kilogram. So we want to be increasing that. And 65% of the data was above 35. 16% was above 70 milligrams per kilogram Col P. So a bit of a take-home message, 2016 to 18 grid soil sampling demonstrated a high level of variability is common for both pH and phosphorus in this area, and a variable rate approach has a high potential for economic and agronomic benefits. And then just lastly, where to next for us? So this autumn we plan to remap a whole heap of paddocks that were grid mapped and VR spread in 2016. So we only started doing the grid mapping sort of early to mid 2016. So we're now at the point where we can come back and quantify how we've gone and build our knowledge about acidification rates in different soils and different zones. Another thing that we want to look at is further research into gypsum application rates and the applicability of topsoil ESP and CEC maps, potentially with some strategic deeper testing, and also just further research into the best practice and soil testing methods in acid subsoils. Righto, that's all. Thank you.